In the heart of Mississippi in 1849, where cotton grew taller than free men's dreams and the Mississippi River carried more tears than water, there exists a story that official records never dared to document. The Riverside Mansion, with its white columns and perfumed gardens, was the stage for what newspapers of the time called an inexplicable family tragedy, a wedding banquet that transformed into a collective wake. In a single January night, 17 members of Warren County's most prominent families succumbed to a slow and agonizing death, their faces contorted in expressions that doctors could never explain. What they didn't know was that the answer lay in the calloused hands of a man who had lost everything, but found something much more powerful: the patience to serve justice on the finest plate that society had ever tasted. This is the story of Marcus, a cook who transformed spices into revenge and recipes into death sentences. A man who chose his own surname when he decided he would no longer be anyone's property. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The Riverside Plantation. The Riverside Plantation stretched over more than 2,000 acres along the muddy banks of the Mississippi, its endless rows of cotton undulating like a white sea under the scorching summer sun of 1848. It was one of Warren County's most prosperous properties, known not only for the quality of its harvest, but for the opulence of its main house, and primarily for the excellence of its table. Colonel James Riverside had inherited the property from his father and expanded it with the same calculated brutality that characterized men of his position. Tall, thin as a whip, and with eyes the color of winter ice, he commanded his 340 slaves with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He firmly believed that severe discipline, tempered with small concessions, maintained order better than pure violence. The jewel of his property wasn't the cotton, but rather the culinary reputation that attracted visitors from neighboring plantations. Politicians from Jackson, merchants who navigated the Mississippi, and planters from nearby counties made sure to accept invitations to Riverside dinners. The secret of this fame resided in the hands of a man whom few guests ever saw, but whose talent everyone savored. Marcus had arrived at the plantation as a child in 1829, part of a lot of slaves purchased from a bankrupt property in South Carolina. He was then only 8 years old, with large, curious eyes and an extraordinary memory for flavors and aromas. The head cook of the time, an elderly man named Papa Elijah, soon noticed the boy's natural gift and took him under his protection. For 16 years, Marcus learned not only to cook, but to understand the secrets of spices, the science behind fermentation, the mysteries of herbs that grew wild in the nearby swamps. Papa Elijah, born in Africa and brought to America as a young man, carried ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants and their properties. He taught Marcus that every leaf, every root, every seed had a purpose, some to heal, others to cause sleep, and some had purposes that were better not mentioned aloud. Our people have known the secrets of the earth since before the ships, since before the chains, Papa Elijah would say while they dried herbs under the moon. This knowledge lives in the blood, passed from father to son, like an inheritance that can never be stolen. Papa Elijah also taught Marcus something equally valuable: how to read and write. During the long winter nights when kitchen work diminished, he showed the boy how to form letters in the sand, how to decipher words in the main house's recipe books, how to keep secret records of his discoveries about plants. The old healer always emphasized that knowledge was the only inheritance that no one could steal. If Marcus knew how to read, he could learn anything. If he knew how to write, he could leave his mark on the world, even when others thought he was invisible. When Papa Elijah died of fever in 1845, Marcus naturally assumed his place as head cook. He was then 24 years old, had married a woman named Rachel, and had 3 children: Thomas, born in 1841, Mary, born in 1842, and little David, born in 1844. The family lived in a cabin slightly larger than the others, a privilege granted due to Marcus's importance to the house's reputation. Colonel Riverside rarely addressed Marcus directly, communicating his demands through his wife, Rosalind, a pale and nervous woman who spent most of her time embroidering and taking laudanum for her nervous conditions. It was Rosalind who planned the menus for special occasions, always consulting a recipe book that had belonged to her mother-in-law. But it was Marcus who transformed those instructions into edible works of art. The main house kitchen was Marcus's kingdom. Spacious, with a large iron stove with multiple ovens, shelves filled with spices from distant places through river trade, and a pantry that rivaled those of urban hotels. He commanded a team of 6 assistants, all young men and women he had trained himself. Each had their specialty. Samuel handled breads and sweets, Hannah prepared meats, Lily was responsible for preserves and pickles. But Marcus kept the most important secrets to himself. He was the one who prepared the special sauces that made guests sigh with pleasure, who knew exactly how long to let the ham smoke to achieve perfect texture, who knew the exact combination of herbs that transformed a simple chicken broth into something memorable. Marcus's children lived in the slave quarters with the other children, but sometimes came to the kitchen when he needed to watch them while working. Thomas, at 7 years old in 1848, already showed interest in learning carpentry and frequently accompanied the plantation's carpenter when his father's kitchen duties allowed. Mary, at 6 years old, had inherited her father's curiosity about plants and sometimes accompanied him when Marcus collected herbs near the slave quarters. David, still small at 4 years old, was content to play with corn dolls that Marcus made for him in his rare free moments. Life on the plantation followed a predictable rhythm, and within the limits imposed by slavery, was relatively stable. Marcus had found a way to protect his family through his indispensable usefulness. The colonel would never sell the cook who guaranteed his social reputation, and by extension would never separate his family. It was an illusion of security that he carefully cultivated, without realizing that stability in a slave's life was always a mirage, always dependent on the whims and moods of those who held absolute power over their lives. The dark turn. Victoria Riverside, the colonel's eldest daughter, had recently returned from her studies in Charleston. At 22 years old, she was a younger and crueler version of her father, with the same cold gaze, but without the discipline that came with age and responsibility. She had developed during her college years a taste for diversions that involved exercising power over those who couldn't defend themselves. Marcus had noticed how Victoria looked at his younger assistants, how she found excuses to visit the kitchen when her father wasn't present. He had begun keeping everyone always busy when she appeared, always under his direct supervision. But he couldn't be everywhere at once, and Victoria had all the time in the world. What Marcus didn't know was that Victoria had noticed his children during their brief visits to the kitchen, and that in her twisted mind, she was beginning to see in them an opportunity to amuse herself in a way she considered completely innocent. After all, they were just games and slave children. Well, they needed to learn early what their place in the world was. During the hot summer afternoons, when fieldwork slightly diminished, Victoria often wandered the property looking for ways to entertain herself. She had developed a particular interest in educating slave children about hierarchy and obedience, creating cruel games that she considered valuable lessons. Marcus sensed the growing tension in the quarters when Victoria appeared. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men lowered their eyes and continued working with renewed intensity. But he couldn't imagine that his own children would soon become the focus of the young mistress's twisted attention. The tragedy. The autumn of 1848 arrived in Mississippi with deceptive beauty, painting the oak leaves in golden tones and filling the air with the sweet aroma of sugar cane being harvested. It was the time of year that Marcus most appreciated, when kitchen work intensified with the preparation of winter preserves and dinners became more elaborate, celebrating the season's abundance. That October morning, Marcus woke before dawn, as he always did. The air was fresh, almost cold, and a thin mist covered the fields like a ghostly veil. He lit the fire in the kitchen and began preparing breakfast for the main house, his movements automatic after so many years of routine. Rachel had already left for her work in the laundry, and the children still slept deeply on their small straw mattresses in the quarters. The day promised to be special. The colonel had announced that he would receive a group of neighboring planters interested in discussing cultivation techniques and possible commercial partnerships. It was the type of occasion that demanded Marcus's best, a lunch that would impress men accustomed to fine dining and convince them that Riverside was a prosperous and well-managed property. Marcus had planned the menu meticulously: turtle soup with sherry, roasted duck with wild berry sauce, ham glazed with honey and mustard, sides of caramelized sweet potato and green beans with almonds. For dessert, his famous bourbon pudding with vanilla cream, a recipe he had perfected over the years and that never failed to draw praise from guests. While supervising his assistant's work, Marcus allowed himself a moment of silent pride. He had transformed the Riverside Plantation kitchen into something that rivaled the best establishments in Natchez or Vicksburg. His work not only sustained the colonel's social reputation, but also provided relative protection for his family. It was a delicate balance, but one he had learned to maintain with mastery. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Thomas, Mary, and David appeared in the kitchen, as they did when Marcus needed to watch them during work. Thomas had fed the chickens in the quarters. Mary had helped the older women collect eggs, and David, still too small for serious work, had simply tried to help his older siblings. Marcus gave them pieces of sweet bread left over from the main house's breakfast and instructed them to stay near the kitchen where he could supervise them. He established the rules as he always did. The children should remain visible, Thomas should take care of his younger siblings, and David shouldn't wander off. Thomas, serious like a miniature adult, nodded with understanding and assumed responsibility for his siblings. Marcus watched them play in the small courtyard behind the kitchen, their laughter echoing in the morning air. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different future for them. Perhaps Thomas could learn to read and write as he had learned. Perhaps Mary could use her knowledge of plants for something beyond survival. Perhaps David could grow up in a world where being black didn't automatically mean being someone's property. They were dangerous dreams, he knew, dreams that could break a father's heart, but they were all he had to offer his children besides love and protection. The morning passed quickly in lunch preparation. The guests arrived at noon, well-dressed men arriving on horseback and in simple wagons, speaking in loud voices about cotton, prices, and cultivation techniques. Marcus could hear them from the other side of the dining room door, while serving the dishes, their voices confident and satisfied. The lunch was an absolute success. He could tell by the way the guests savored each dish, by the praise that reached the kitchen through the servants who served at the table. The colonel was clearly satisfied, and Rosalind even sent a congratulatory message through Samuel. It was almost 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Marcus realized he hadn't seen the children for some time. Normally, they appeared in the kitchen around noon, asking for something to eat or simply to be near their father. Their absence left him slightly uneasy, but he consoled himself thinking they were probably playing in the quarters and had lost track of time. It was Hannah who brought the first alarming news. She had gone to get firewood from the depot near the quarters and seen smoke coming from the old barn, the one that was no longer used to store hay and stood at the boundary between the cotton fields and the slave area. Hannah arrived running to the kitchen, breathless, reporting the presence of heavy smoke coming from the old barn. Marcus's heart stopped for a moment. The old barn was near the quarters where the children sometimes played when they weren't under his direct supervision. Without thinking twice, he dropped the spoon he was using to stir the sauce and ran toward the door, shouting over his shoulder for Samuel to take care of the kitchen, already running through the fields. The smoke was visible in the distance, a thick black column rising against the blue afternoon sky. Marcus ran like he had never run his life, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Other slaves had noticed the smoke and were running in the same direction, carrying water buckets from nearby wells. When he reached the barn, the structure was already completely engulfed in flames. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, and the black smoke made it difficult to breathe. But it was the sound that terrified him, muffled screams coming from inside the burning structure, voices he immediately recognized. Marcus screamed about his children being inside, trying to approach the entrance. Strong hands held him, preventing him from running into the inferno. It was one of the field workers who had come running upon seeing the smoke, shouting that he would die, struggling to hold him while he fought desperately. Other men tried to approach the entrance, but the flames were too intense. The old dry wooden structure burned like paper, and the roof was already beginning to collapse. The screams from inside grew weaker, then ceased completely. Marcus stopped fighting and fell to his knees in the dirt, a sound coming from his throat that was neither quite a scream nor quite a moan, but something more primitive, deeper. It was the sound of a soul breaking in half. It took almost 2 hours for the fire to be completely extinguished. When they could finally enter the smoking ruins, they found the 3 small bodies embraced in a corner where they had tried to hide from the flames. Thomas had tried to protect his younger siblings with his own body, but it hadn't been enough. What was later discovered was that the barn door had been locked from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the children inside before setting fire to the structure. But who and why? Victoria Riverside appeared at the fire scene about an hour later, claiming to have been riding in the distant fields and only seeing the smoke when returning to the house. She expressed her condolences to the colonel for the loss of valuable property and suggested it had probably been an accident. Children playing with matches, perhaps. But Lily, one of the younger kitchen assistants, had seen Victoria near the barn that morning. She had gone to collect wild herbs near the quarters and seen her talking with the children, laughing at something Thomas had said. When she told this to Marcus 3 days after the funeral, her words were like a second death. Lily revealed that Victoria had been playing with the children, mentioning knowing a new game they would like. She had instructed the children to enter the barn, promising to fetch a surprise for them. Marcus said nothing. He just nodded and continued peeling potatoes for dinner. But something inside him had changed at that moment. Something had died along with his children, and something new had been born in its place. That night, alone in his empty cabin, Marcus made a decision. He would no longer be just Marcus, the Riverside plantation cook. From that moment on, he would be Marcus Washington. He had chosen the surname of the first president, the man who had fought for his nation's freedom. And he too would fight for his own freedom, not the freedom to flee. That would be too easy, too quick. He wanted the freedom that came with justice, the freedom that would only come when those who had taken everything from him paid the full price. Marcus Washington began a plan, the preparation. During the days that followed the funeral, he maintained his normal routine in the kitchen. But at night, when everyone slept, he silently left his cabin and walked to the place where his children had died. There, kneeling among the still, smoking ruins, he made promises that no human ear heard. He whispered to the blackened earth about Thomas, Mary, and David, promising he wouldn't forget and would make them all pay. And on moonless nights, when the darkness was deepest, he began collecting the plants that Papa Elijah had taught him to recognize. Plants that grew only in places where death had touched the earth, plants that carried in their roots and leaves the darkest secrets of nature. The months that followed the children's death transformed Marcus in ways that no one at the Riverside plantation could completely understand. Externally, he continued being the same efficient cook as always, perhaps even more meticulous, more dedicated to details. But those who knew him well noticed subtle changes that left them uneasy. Rachel was the first to notice. Her husband had become silent in a different way. It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, more calculated. He spent hours awake during the night, sitting by the window of their cabin, looking toward the main house with an expression she couldn't decipher. When she tried to talk about the future, about perhaps trying to have other children, he responded as if she were speaking a foreign language. Marcus had made it clear that there was no future in his mind, only the present, and the present was all that mattered. In the kitchen, Marcus had begun making subtle changes. He insisted on personally preparing all dishes that went to the Riverside family table, not allowing any of his assistants to touch the food after he finished the final seasonings. He said it was to maintain quality, but Hannah noticed that he had begun storing certain herbs and spices in a locked cabinet to which only he had the key. When questioned about these unknown herbs, Marcus simply explained they were special ingredients reserved for special occasions. What Hannah didn't know was that Marcus had begun making nocturnal expeditions to the swamps surrounding the plantation. Using the knowledge that Papa Elijah had transmitted to him, he collected plants that grew only in specific soils under specific conditions. Mushrooms that sprouted on rotting logs, vines that wrapped around dead trees, roots that could only be harvested during autumn and early winter. Papa Elijah had taught him about these plants when he was young, but always with severe warnings. Some are for healing pains that white doctors don't know how to cure, he had said, showing some dried leaves. And others, well, others are for when healing is no longer possible, when only justice remains. Marcus now perfectly understood what the old healer had meant. During the winter of 1848, he experimented. Small doses, almost imperceptible, added to Victoria Riverside's food. Nothing that could kill her. Not yet. Just enough to cause discomfort, to make her question her own health. Inexplicable stomach pains, nausea that came and went without apparent reason, nights of insomnia, followed by days of extreme fatigue. Victoria began complaining about her health with increasing frequency. She consulted doctors in Vicksburg and even in Natchez, but none could find a cause for her symptoms. Some suggested it could be stress. Others recommended dietary changes. One particularly perceptive doctor suggested that perhaps she should avoid heavily spiced foods for a while. Marcus almost smiled when he heard this recommendation being discussed in the dining room. If only they knew that the problem wasn't the spices he used, but rather the special ingredients he had begun adding. Meanwhile, he observed. He studied the house patterns, meal schedules, each family member's food preferences. He discovered that the Colonel had a predilection for rich, dark sauces, that Rosalind preferred delicate and lightly sweet dishes, that Victoria liked rare meats and strong seasonings. More importantly, he discovered that the Riverside family was planning something big for early 1849. Pearl, the Colonel's youngest daughter, had become engaged to Sylvester Thompson, son of a prominent cotton planter family from the neighboring county. The wedding was scheduled for late January and would be the region's most important social occasion in months. Rosalind had begun preparations months in advance, consulting Marcus almost daily about the menu for the wedding banquet. It would be an intimate event, just for close families and some dear relatives. Riverside's culinary reputation would be put to the test before people who really mattered to the family. During one of these consultations, Rosalind emphasized that the wedding needed to be absolutely perfect, a very special family event where everyone would remember the Riverside's hospitality. Marcus assured it would be perfect, a promise he truly intended to keep. And he really promised it would be perfect, perfectly planned, perfectly executed, perfectly final. During the long winter nights, Marcus began elaborating his plan. It wouldn't just be a matter of poisoning the food. That would be too simple, too obvious. He wanted something more subtle, more artistic. He wanted each person present at the banquet to receive exactly what they deserved, in the exact measure of their sins. He began researching who would be present at the wedding. Through conversations he heard in the main house, letters he saw being written, preparations he observed, he built a mental map of who would be present that night. The complete Riverside family, the Colonel, Rosalind, Victoria, Pearl, and her younger brother Charles. The Thompson family, Sylvester's parents, his two brothers and one sister. Some close uncles and cousins from both families. 17 people in total. 17 lives that had benefited directly or indirectly from the system that had killed his children. 17 people who had never questioned the right to own other human beings, to separate families, to treat children as property. Each name, he discovered, was added to his mental list. And for each name, he began planning a specific destiny. Colonel Riverside, who had allowed his daughter to kill 3 innocent children and then covered up the crime, would receive the main course, literally and figuratively. Victoria, the direct murderer, would have a slower, more painful death. Rosalind, who had lived her entire life benefiting from others' suffering without ever questioning, would die confused and frightened, without understanding what was happening. And the others would receive a lesson about the true costs of their prosperity. Marcus spent the rest of winter perfecting his recipes, not just the culinary ones, but the others, those that Papa Elijah had taught him in secret, those he had learned alone through careful experimentation and trial and error. He tested dosages, studied effects, calculated action times. A particularly important discovery was that he could prepare special dishes for the few children who would be present, the Thompsons' young children. They would receive completely different food, sweet porridges, and warm milk that would make them sleep deeply during the banquet. Marcus had no interest in hurting innocents. His justice was precise, directed only at those who carried guilt. During his nocturnal expeditions to the swamps, he also collected plants with mild sedative properties. The children would sleep peacefully while the adults paid for their family's sins. When spring arrived in Mississippi in 1849, Marcus Washington was ready. He had transformed from a grieving cook into something much more dangerous, a man with a plan, knowledge, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. Pearl Riverside's wedding would be remembered for generations, but not for the reasons the family expected. The final act. The morning of January 27th, 1849 dawned clear and cold in Mississippi, with a thin layer of frost covering the cotton fields like powdered sugar on a cake. It was Pearl Riverside's wedding day, and the plantation had been bustling with activity since before sunrise. Marcus had awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning, as he had planned for months. Not from nervousness or anxiety, but because he had much work ahead, the kind of work that required absolute precision, perfect timing, and above all, a calm that he had cultivated during the long months of preparation. The main house kitchen had been transformed into a military operations center. 3 ovens functioned simultaneously. Enormous pots bubbled over the fire, and his 5 assistants moved in a rehearsed choreography, each responsible for specific aspects of the banquet. But Marcus maintained absolute control over the most important elements: the seasonings, the sauces, and especially the final touches of each dish. The menu had been planned with the meticulousness of a general preparing for battle. Fresh oyster appetizers from New Orleans through river trade, served with mignonette sauce he had prepared himself. Turtle soup with sherry, a specialty he had perfected over the years. The main course would be a whole roasted pork glazed with honey and mustard, accompanied by smoked ham, roasted duck with cherry sauce, and a variety of sides that would make guests remember this banquet for the rest of their lives, which, as Marcus knew, wouldn't be very long. The guests began arriving around noon. Wagons and horses climbed the circular road leading to the main house, bringing the Riverside's closest families. Marcus observed them discreetly through the kitchen window, identifying faces he had studied for months through descriptions and overheard conversations. There was the Thompson family patriarch, Colonel Wilfred Thompson, known for his brutal disciplinary practices on his own plantations. Beside him, his wife, Matilda, who was famous for separating slave families as a strategy to prevent excessive bonds. The 2 eldest Thompson sons, Seth and Randolph, both following their father's cruel footsteps. The youngest daughter, Jeanette, who despite her youth already demonstrated the same contempt for slaves that characterized her family. 17 guests in total, each carrying their own guilt, their own sins against humanity. And Marcus had prepared something special for each of them. The wedding ceremony was held in the main house garden under a pavilion decorated with white flowers and silk ribbons. Pearl was radiant in her lace dress imported from Charleston, and Sylvester Thompson looked appropriately nervous beside the improvised altar. Reverend Matthews, a corpulent man who served several plantations in the region, conducted the ceremony with his usual sonorous voice. Marcus observed everything from the kitchen window while supervising the final preparations. There was something almost surreal about seeing all that celebration of happiness and love, knowing what was to come. But he felt no remorse, only a cold and calculated satisfaction. When the ceremony ended and the guests headed to the dining room, Marcus made an almost imperceptible signal to his assistants. It was time to serve. The hall had been decorated with the best the Riverside house had to offer. Crystals reflected the light of dozens of candles. The family's silver gleamed on the white linen tablecloth, and elaborate floral arrangements perfumed the air. The guests took their places at an oval-shaped table that dominated the environment, with the newlyweds at the center and the most important families in positions of honor. Before the main banquet, Marcus had prepared something special for the 3 children present, 2 young Thompson children and a Riverside niece. He personally served sweet porridges seasoned with honey and mild spices, plus warm milk with vanilla. The children savored the delicacies and within minutes began yawning. Their mothers, thinking it was just natural fatigue from the day's excitement, took them to rest in one of the upper rooms. Marcus had calculated perfectly. The children would sleep deeply for hours, protected from what was to come. The first course was served without incident. The oysters were received with general approval, and Marcus noted with satisfaction that even the most demanding guests seemed impressed. He had used only a very light touch of his special ingredients in this dish, just enough to begin the process to prepare the guests' digestive systems for what was to come. The turtle soup was an even greater success. Colonel Riverside stood to make a toast, publicly praising his cook's skill and provoking a round of applause from the guests. Marcus, observing discreetly through the kitchen's half-open door, allowed himself a small, cold smile. It was during the main course that things began to get interesting. Marcus had spent weeks calculating dosages through trial and error for each person. Colonel Wilfred Thompson, for example, received a generous portion of the roasted pork, seasoned with a special combination of herbs he had collected during autumn and early winter. The effect would be gradual but inexorable. First, a sensation of heat, then growing nausea, followed by convulsions, and finally respiratory paralysis. For Matilda Thompson, who had the habit of separating slave families, Marcus had prepared something more poetic. Her dish contained a carefully calculated dose of a toxin that would cause terrible hallucinations before death. She would see her own victims returning to haunt her, feel the despair of the family she had separated. The Thompson sons received dishes containing substances that would attack their nervous systems, causing gradual loss of motor coordination followed by paralysis. They would feel their bodies slowly failing, just as they had failed to protect those under their power. In Victoria received special treatment. Marcus had saved for her a combination of 3 different toxins, each activating at different moments. First would come intense abdominal pain, then loss of motor coordination, and finally a paralysis that would leave her conscious but unable to move while her body slowly stopped functioning. The banquet proceeded for almost 2 hours, with guests savoring each dish and effusively praising the food's quality. There were toasts to the newlyweds, speeches about family prosperity, animated conversations about politics and business. The atmosphere was one of genuine celebration and contentment. It was around 9 at night that the first symptoms began to appear. Colonel Thompson was the first to complain of sudden malaise. He had just finished a speech about the importance of maintaining discipline on plantations when he suddenly paled and put his hand to his stomach. His wife, sitting beside him, asked if he was well, but before he could answer, she herself began feeling a burning sensation in her throat. Within minutes, the elegant hall transformed into a scene of chaos. Guests began rising abruptly from their chairs, some running outside, seeking fresh air, others doubling over in pain on the table. The sound of animated conversations was replaced by moans of agony and screams of panic. Victoria Riverside tried to stand to help the guests, but her legs didn't obey. She looked down, confused, trying to understand why her body wasn't responding to her commands. It was then that her eyes met Marcus's, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway to observe the results of his work. For a moment, they looked at each other across the chaotic hall, and in that moment Victoria understood. Her eyes widened with terror when comprehension arrived, but it was already too late. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. Marcus observed her for a few more seconds, then calmly turned and returned to the kitchen. He had work to do, dishes to wash, evidence to destroy, an escape to execute. But first, he had one last task. From his apron pocket, he took out a small piece of paper where he had written a message in his best handwriting. He placed the paper on the kitchen table, clearly visible, and left through the back door. The message simply said, "For Thomas, Mary, and David. Justice has been served. Marcus Washington." When the first neighbors and the local doctor arrived at the Riverside plantation, the next morning, they found 17 bodies scattered throughout the dining hall, some still sitting in their chairs, others fallen on the floor in grotesque positions. There were no adult survivors. The 3 children were found sleeping deeply in the upper room, completely unharmed and with no memory of what had happened during the night. And Marcus Washington had disappeared into the darkness, taking with him only the clothes on his body and the satisfaction of justice finally served. The aftermath. The discovery of the carnage at the Riverside plantation sent shock waves throughout the entire South. 17 of Mississippi's most prominent citizens dead in a single night during what should have been a celebration of union and prosperity. Newspapers in Jackson, Natchez, and even distant cities like Charleston and Richmond dedicated entire pages to what quickly became known as the Riverside Wedding Massacre. Authorities arrived at the plantation on the morning of January 28th, alerted by Rachel, who had found the main house door open and an unnatural silence coming from inside. The Warren County Sheriff, a man named Patrick Lambert, would later describe the scene as something from Dante's worst nightmares. The bodies were scattered throughout the elegant dining hall in positions suggesting extreme agony. Some had tried to flee, being found near doors and windows. Others had fallen on the table, their faces contorted in expressions of unbearable pain. Most disturbing was that many still had their eyes open, as if they had remained conscious until the end. Victoria Riverside was found in her chair, body rigid, but eyes still gleaming with terror. The doctor who examined the bodies later commented that he had never seen such an intense expression of fear preserved in death. It was as if Victoria had understood exactly what was happening and why, but was unable to do anything to stop it. The initial investigation focused on the possibility of mass poisoning, an obvious conclusion given the context, but determining the specific agent proved more challenging. Doctors found varied symptoms they had never seen before, each victim presenting different signs of suffering. It was as if each person had been poisoned individually with substances chosen specifically for them. It was when they found the message in the kitchen that the true nature of the crime began to reveal itself. For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Marcus Washington was written in careful handwriting, the words burning in the minds of all who read them like a confession and a declaration of war simultaneously. Colonel Riverside, who had been traveling on business in Natchez during the wedding and thus escaped the tragedy, returned immediately upon receiving the news. When shown the message, his face visibly paled. He knew exactly who Thomas, Mary, and David were, and began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. How could a simple cook execute such a plan? The colonel murmured to himself. But Marcus had not been a simple cook for a long time. He had transformed into something much more dangerous, a man with knowledge, determination, and a thirst for justice that had consumed everything else in his life. The search for Marcus Washington began immediately. Posters with his description were spread throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. A reward of $500 was offered for his capture, dead or alive, a considerable sum for the time, reflecting both the fear and anger his act had provoked. But Marcus had disappeared like smoke. Some reported seeing him walking rural roads heading north. Others swore he had been seen boarding a steamboat on the Mississippi River. There were even rumors that he had been helped by a network of abolitionists, though no concrete evidence was ever found. The truth was simpler and more complex at the same time. Marcus had planned his escape with the same meticulousness he had applied to the poisoning. For months, he had hidden small quantities of food and supplies in strategic locations along a route he had memorized through the swamps and forests of Mississippi. He knew he couldn't use the main roads or navigable rivers. Those would be the first places they would look for him. Instead, he followed old hunting trails and paths known only to fugitive slaves, moving mainly at night and resting during the day in hideouts he had prepared in advance. Rachel was extensively interrogated by authorities, but genuinely didn't know where her husband had gone. She had noticed the changes in him after the children's death, but never imagined he was capable of something so elaborate and devastating. When shown the message he had left, she cried. not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride, terror, and loss. Marcus was always stronger than anyone imagined, Rachel admitted to Sheriff Lambert, but I never thought he was capable of such an act. The consequences of the massacre spread far beyond the Riverside plantation. Planters throughout the South began looking at their own domestic slaves with renewed suspicion. Cooks in particular were subjected to increased surveillance. Many prominent families dismissed their slave cooks and hired free whites, paying high salaries for a sense of security that may have been illusory. Paranoia spread like a disease. Elaborate dinners, which had once been symbols of Southern status and hospitality, became tense events where hosts tasted each dish before serving guests. Some planters went to the extreme of hiring professional tasters, like ancient kings. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. For the first time, the Southern elite was forced to confront the reality that their slaves were not passive property, but human beings with memories, emotions, and most frighteningly, the capacity to plan and execute revenge. Marcus Washington had broken a fundamental illusion upon which the entire slave society was based. The illusion that submission was natural, that oppression could continue indefinitely without consequences. 3 months after the massacre, a merchant reported seeing a black man working on a small farm in Tennessee, a state where fugitive slave laws were less rigorously enforced. The description vaguely matched Marcus's, but when authorities investigated, they found no trace of him. There were other sightings over the years, in Kentucky, Ohio, even Canada, but none were confirmed. The truth about Marcus Washington's final fate remained a mystery. Some believed he had died in the swamps during his escape. Others insisted he had managed to reach freedom in the North or Canada. There were even those who whispered that he was still alive somewhere, living under a false name, perhaps even helping other slaves escape. What wasn't a mystery was the legacy he had left. In slave quarters throughout the South, his name was whispered with a mixture of admiration and terror. He had proven that even the most oppressed could find ways to resist, to fight back, to demand justice. For slave owners, Marcus Washington became a recurring nightmare, a constant reminder that their prosperity was built on foundations much more fragile than they had imagined. Every meal became a matter of trust, every cook a potential source of danger. And somewhere, perhaps on a small farm in Ohio, or in a modest house in Detroit, or walking the free streets of Boston, a man who had chosen his own surname continued living. No longer as someone's property, no longer as a victim, but as Marcus Washington, a man who had proven that justice, even when delayed, eventually finds its way. The legacy. The Riverside plantation never fully recovered from the massacre. The colonel tried to rebuild, but the property was cursed in everyone's mind. Free workers refused to accept employment there, and even slaves from other plantations whispered stories about ghosts that haunted the cotton fields. Eventually, the property was sold for a fraction of its previous value. The main house was demolished, and the fields were converted to other uses. But the memory remained, passed from generation to generation as a reminder that even in the most oppressive system, resistance finds a way. The 3 children who survived that night, the 2 Thompson children and the Riverside niece, grew up without any clear memory of what had happened. Their adoptive families never told them the complete truth, only that their parents had died in an inexplicable tragedy. But sometimes in their dreams they could still hear the echo of a gentle voice humming lullabies, and they would wake with tears in their eyes without knowing why. Rachel remained in the region for a few more years, working as a laundress after the plantation's dissolution. She never remarried, but was frequently seen visiting the small cemetery where Thomas, Mary, and David were buried. When she died in 1867, witnesses reported that her last words were a message from Marcus, expressing understanding and forgiveness. Reverend Matthews, who had officiated the fatal wedding, never again managed to perform a ceremony without trembling. He developed the habit of fasting for 3 days before any religious event, convinced that God was testing his faith through fear. He died 2 years later, some say from pure terror, others from a guilty conscience that finally consumed him. And sometimes, on cold winter nights in Mississippi, when the wind blows through the fields where cotton once grew, local residents swear they can still hear the echo of a voice whispering through the darkness. For Thomas, Mary, and David. But there are also those who say they hear something more. The sound of firm footsteps walking down the dusty road. The noise of a man who chose his own destiny and never looked back. Because Marcus Washington wasn't just a story of revenge. He was a story of transformation, of a man who refused to accept that his pain was insignificant, that his justice was impossible. He proved that even in the darkest moments of American history, there were always those who rose against injustice, who paid the price of resistance, who chose freedom even when it cost everything. Conclusion. The story of Marcus Washington remains as one of the most disturbing and complex episodes in 19th century American history. In a single night, he transformed a wedding banquet into a court of justice where 17 people paid with their lives for the sins of an entire society. His act wasn't just personal revenge. It was a declaration that even those considered property possessed agency, memory, and the capacity to demand accountability. He proved that knowledge, when combined with determination and opportunity, could be more powerful than any chain or whip. What makes Marcus's story even more impactful is his surgical precision. He didn't kill indiscriminately, but chose each victim based on their specific crimes against humanity. Each death was personalized, each suffering calculated to reflect the suffering these people had caused others. And in his final compassion, he protected innocent children, proving that his justice was guided by principles, not bloodlust. Today, more than 170 years later, Marcus Washington's story continues to echo through time as a somber reminder that injustice, when ignored for too long, eventually finds its own form of correction. He wasn't just a man who lost his children. He became the embodiment of the collective memory of all those who suffered in silence. What's most impressive about his story isn't just the magnitude of his revenge, but the patience with which he executed it. For months, he transformed his pain into knowledge, his anger into strategy, his grief into determination. Each spice he added to the dishes that fatal night carried the weight of generations of unacknowledged suffering. Marcus Washington forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the price of systematic oppression. He reminds us that behind every system of domination exist real human beings with hearts that can be broken and minds that can plan retribution. His choice to adopt the surname Washington wasn't accidental. It was a declaration of personal independence, a claim to his own identity in a world that saw him only as property. In that simple act of renaming himself, he transformed from victim to agent of his own history. Marcus's final fate remains a mystery, and perhaps that's better. His true victory wasn't escaping man's justice, but proving that justice has many faces, and sometimes it comes served on a fine porcelain plate, seasoned with herbs that grow in the dark swamps of Mississippi. The riverside plantation may have been destroyed, the bodies may have been buried, but Marcus Washington's memory lives on. He became more than a person. He became a symbol, a warning, a promise that even in the cruelest systems, resistance finds a way. And perhaps somewhere on a cold night, when the wind blows through the empty fields where cotton once grew, you can still hear the echo of his voice whispering through the darkness. Justice may be served cold, but it is always served. If this story touched something inside you, it's because Marcus Washington's memory still walks among us, reminding us that true freedom sometimes requires a price that few are willing to pay. Share this story with someone who needs to know that even in history's darkest moments, there are always those who refuse to accept injustice in silence. If you want more stories like this, revealing forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like to support this work and tell us in the comments. Do you believe Marcus Washington found true freedom in the end? Was his justice legitimate, or was it just revenge? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us Marcus Washington, a man who decided that some injustices are too great to be forgiven and that some memories are too powerful to be forgotten.